are all over, so. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We are excited to be here today for our first ever Women's History virtual interview series, Writing Her Story. With me is Jamaica Miles, co-founder of All of Us community action group here in Schenectady. All of Us is a Black-led, majority LGBTQIA+ grassroots community organization fighting for Black liberation and an end of all forms of racism, oppression, and exploitation. Jamaica also serves on the Schenectady City School District Board. She is a fierce activist, look at her, advocate and organizer, working every day to unite all people across race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, geography, language, country of origin, and ability levels to fight against injustices and inequality everywhere. She's making Herstory history every day. Welcome, Jamaica.
Thank you for having me, Kim. I'm so glad to be here and honored to be the first during Women's History Month.
Yeah, it's an incredible, incredible month where we really want to celebrate all of the accomplishments of women throughout history. And again, this began in 1911. Very interesting that the first International Women's Day, March 8th, began in 1911. Here it was commemorated as National Women's History Month in 1978 with a day. Then it became a week in 1980. And in 1987, we said there's not enough to cram all into 1 week. And now we have a month-long celebration, and should be a year-long celebration of women making history in our community, our neighborhoods, and throughout our nation and the world. So, Jamaica, tell us about you. Tell us about All of Us. Tell us about how you became a history maker or herstory maker.
Well, that's a lot. We only have 30 minutes. But so as most people know, I was born and raised in the city of Schenectady. I grew up on Hamilton Hill. With a two-parent household for most of my childhood. And life was great until I realized all of the horrors that exist in this world. I had an amazing father and mother who did their best to protect me from the ills of society and the trauma that would later unfold. And then as I grew up and I grew older and realized not just the injustice, but the inequity that existed, that I faced as a woman, that I faced as a Black woman, as I faced at all of these other intersections that make up who I am, I was not okay with it. I don't think there was ever a point in my life that I just went, oh, well, that's just how it is. I've often been known for speaking truth to power. I'm sure my fourth grade teacher would say I spoke a lot. It was always a thing. Shout out to Mrs. Brown. And then in February of 2020, me and co-founder Sean Young decided to start All of Us. The focus was Schenectady. It always started with Schenectady. We were both born here, and we recognized there wasn't an advocacy voice here in Schenectady. There wasn't a place for people to learn how to speak for themselves, or to learn what's happening in government, or how does government even work, right? Mm-hmm. And so we started All of Us with the mission and vision that you mentioned, right before the pandemic and the uprising, right? Mm-hmm. And we were poised, we were ready. Mm-hmm. To take on what was about to be thrown our way, and to give a space for people to be heard, as well as to continue what is largely education, right? Mm-hmm. And not that we are simply educating our community, but that our community educates us every single day. Mm-hmm. What it means for me to be Jamaica Miles means that I listen and I learn. It means that I move with the purpose of basing everything on a foundation of love. I happen to be a woman of faith, and I take that quite seriously. And I believe that if our motives are based in love and that we're not harming others, then we are making the right decisions. But if we move in a way that intentionally or unintentionally hurts others, takes from their ability to live their lives as their full selves, then we've got change to make. Mm-hmm. And so my purpose is to create change so that every individual has access and opportunity to thrive, and no one is struggling to survive.
Wow. Thank you, Jamaica, for that introductory look into your mind, body, and spirit. So what I would like to ask you, though, we talked about Mrs. Brown, fourth grade teacher. Talk a little bit more about the women femme in your family, and what traits do they share? How have they informed your opinions of what women femme should be like?
Well, as I mentioned, as a child, I was a bit oblivious to what was happening, right? I didn't realize it wasn't until I was older that I heard the stories of the women in my family and their struggles and their triumphs, um, and that truly they were the matriarchs on both sides of my family. My mother um, was from Hoosick Falls, New York. My father from Richmond, Virginia. Both of them on farms, but in different parts, in different lives in America. A white woman from rural New York, very much different from a black man from the South, right?
Mhm.
And the two of them coming together, but learning that there were common struggles in those families,
Mhm.
especially when it came to the women. Uh, my grandmother on my mother's side raised 13 children, and not in an easy world where she was often neglected and not treated with the love that she should have. And so seeing her as this strong woman who cared for us, that loved us, that nurtured us, that fed us, was important. And I saw the same thing with my father's family. Um, my great grandmother lived to be at least 104 because there are family conversations about how old she really was.
Wow.
Yes, and she she told me as a young child, "That's not my president." That was the first time I heard that phrase.
Mm,
It was not in the 80s or 90s or 2000s. It was much before that. Um,
okay.
that this small woman who was born on indigenous land, uh,
Mhm.
and left that land because she would not be told where she could live or who she could love, uh,
Mm,
and that her daughter, my grandmother,
right.
just was full of love and fierce um, support for her children and grandchildren, and
Mhm.
ended up needing to raise her children on her own when her husband died while her children were still young. These are the women that I saw in my life every single day, constantly. Uh, and they weren't lessons that I knew I was learning, right? Because that's the
Right.
thing. You don't always know that you're learning a lesson.
No, you don't.
It's not until moments like this when
The light bulb comes on and you're like,
yeah, and those questions are asked about, who was it in your life? What did you see? What did you
yeah,
know? And that's just from my family. That doesn't even begin to explore the number of people I've interacted with my entire life, like Mrs. Brown, right?
yep,
Who would look down at her glasses and say, "Excuse me." Um, and not because she simply wanted me to be quiet. She just wanted to make sure I was learning, right?
right.
And just everyday people, right? I've had the opportunity to have conversations with some phenomenal folks. Barbara Smith.
Mhm.
I've been able to have lunch and hear about her life and the things that she went through and think about what does that mean today, right?
Right.
Because the history of my
Mhm.
family and the history of the people I've had a chance to speak to
Mhm.
allows me to consider and think about and reflect about what's happening right now.
Sure. Sure. Thank you. So, what makes you a good leader? You talked about fierceness. You talked about um, great grandmother, grandmother, Mrs. Brown, all of these people who have influence. So, what kind of traits do you feel you have that makes you a good leader and makes you stand out? And why do we need more women, femme, in leadership roles? Why is that important?
I think that one of the blessings is that I've always talked a lot. That there's not been a filter, maybe not always a blessing, but that I simply will not let a thing be. Like there is no, oh well, that's the way it is, or one of my favorite phrases, that's just how it's always been.
Always done.
Yeah, that's not something that sits well for me, especially when you can see every day the negative impact it's having on some group, right?
Right.
Or on the vast majority of folks to different degrees. And that's one of the things that I think I bring to today. I also I listen,
Hmm.
and some people might be surprised about that because I talk a lot. I do. There's no question. I talk a lot. I don't say I don't talk a lot. Um, but I do listen. I learned to listen.
Hmm.
And that's the other piece is I am a constant learner. I by no means believe that I know all things about anything. I do know that I have the capability and capacity to continue to learn, to do better, to be better, and make sure that this world is better. I have 4 children. And even if I didn't have those 4 children, there are going to be other people in this world after I leave this plane of existence. I think that we should leave the world in a better place than we found it. And I can't do that if I don't take the time to listen and learn.
Great. Great traits. Great. When we have some self-awareness, as you said, that you like to talk, but you also have trained yourself and or learned how to listen and then process that in a way that keeps you going every day, right? I mean, so that you can continue the activism, the advocacy, and the fight with fierceness and with dignity and respect for all. I mean, it's an amazing thing to see in you. So thank you. I have goosebumps now. But next question. What are some important gains that you feel that women, femme, have made throughout history? Do you have anything that resonates with you that you could say, that really was triumphant?
So there's one person in particular that I mention from time to time. Her name is Ida B. Wells, and she was this tiny little powerhouse. Um, and during a time when all Black people were facing all types of attacks and harm, and it considered lawful to simply lynch Black folks, uh, she stood up and said no. And she had her own newsletter, right? And she used the power of speech to call attention to the lynchings. She's one simple example of the power of an individual to use their voice. And I think about her often. But really, we're talking about a continuation of change, right? Because we've not reached the end. We are not
Absolutely.
in a space where women are treated the same as anyone else, that femme presenting or feminine individuals are given the same rights and liberties as everyone else or taken seriously,
Hmm.
even in academia, right? The voting rights that we fought for and won
Hmm.
was not for all women.
Hmm. Correct.
And so I think that we have made progress, like we have in many other ways, whether it's based on race, religion, all of those ways that we are divided.
Hmm.
But we're not at the end yet. And there are too many names to mention. There are names we don't know
Hmm.
because women are left out of history. There are books written about the men and the women behind them because people never talked about the women in the first place.
Hmm.
Right? And so I think that's one of the things that we definitely move forward on is lifting up the actual history of women, the
Absolutely.
role that we've played, um, but we have a long way to go.
True. And that, when you say that, I reflect back to the information we've found historically for the YW when we, in 1929, a dozen women raised $1 million during the Depression to build our building, but they are listed as Mrs. Henry dot dot dot, Mrs.
Mm,
George dot dot dot. The women's names are not listed. They are listed as their husband's partner, and they're not given. And we've struggled to find actually their first names. So there's a clear example right there of even a YW and empowering women and eliminating racism that we have, that was lost back then. So yeah, totally. So thank you for sharing that. So when looking back at history through the perspective of women, femmes, we find there is no such thing as a single perspective. You helped me craft this question, so I thank you for that. American history has looked different depending on the view of each woman in time. Trans women, immigrant, Black, Latinx, Asian, disabled. Why is it important to look back at history recognizing the different perspectives of women across those identities? And I know this is a long question. And how is it different from the way we typically look at history? And I think you touched on that a little, Jamaica, when you said women in some instances are completely left out of history. So can you talk a little bit about those perspectives and how they're different?
Yeah, absolutely. The identities that each of us hold, right? And this is something I learned from Barbara Smith. It is important for us to recognize how life and society impacts us differently. So when legislators are looking to write laws or policies or practices, and they say this will help all women or this will help all children, right? Without recognizing the different ways that we are impacted in the current systems and structures, then you leave the possibility or probability that not all women, that not all children are going to reap the benefits that you say you are looking to propose. And so if we take the time to listen to the voices of those people during that time and learn from them, their experience, then we're better able to move forward in a way that doesn't marginalize any group. Because history right now is written by the oppressor. It's written by the winner. It is told from the lens of the cisgendered, heteronormative white man, wealthy white man. I mean, in all the different ways that we could add that with a fear of telling the truth. No one wants to look bad, right? So let's tell history through this lens of here's all the good.
Right.
But we're only going to tell the good of a very select group because that's the other piece, right?
Right.
Still, it's a term that, people get uncomfortable with, but the idea of white supremacy. So this is the majority of our history that we talk about, of this ideal group of individuals that did all these wonderful things, and they are notated as white men.
Right.
And then, we'll talk about slavery, not that any other history of Black folks in this country or outside of this country. And we'll talk about the women's right to vote, because that's the only thing, right? They pick and choose moments to speak about and then say we were being inclusive, and they will whitewash it in the first place. If we only listen to MLK's I Have a Dream speech, and we only listen to a certain section of it, then we lose the full context and message that he was given, and we lose the opportunity to watch his growth over time, right? Because at the end of his life was not exactly where he was at the beginning of what we see as his history. So it's necessary for us to dig in, to question, to push, and say, what more could we be learning, especially about women and other marginalized groups that historically have been left out of our books?
Basically untold stories but untold history, because really history is a story of what some people think happened, right? We all pull out the textbooks in school, and we read or read many years ago, and those stories are, as you said, very selective. And now it is our job as people living now to uncover everything that has not been told, has not been shared, the women who have been lost in history and their stories. So
understand the intentionality. Controlling the narrative and the structure of our society by dictating what story is told and how it's told, and by no means believing that, this was a mistake.
No, the system was created that way in order to serve the people who were most who were the winners, as you said,
Absolutely.
Okay, great conversation. All right, next. Has the feminist movement succeeded? Should it be called the feminist movement? We talked about that it has left out many women based on their identities and really focused on white women. So throughout history, feminist movements have often focused on white cisgender women and ignored or excluded women, femme of color, and trans queer voices. How can we be sure to center all women in feminist discourse moving forward? Long question. What do you have to say about it?
It's about intentionality.
Okay.
I think that I saw something actually on the YWCA's page about the difference between someone being in the room and someone being heard.
Okay. Yes.
Right. And so every group, organization, business, institution, they have an opportunity to be intentional to end discrimination and marginalization through their practices, their policies, by being willing to invite people in to look at those things, to say, hey, you know what? We're probably messing up somewhere. Will you look at our practices and policies and show us where we are still discriminating against women and other marginalized groups? We have made progress, right? Simple examples are, women weren't allowed to be things, right? There was an entire list. You could be a teacher because that's women's work. You could clean a house because that's women's work.
Right.
And within all of those jobs, we saw that more often than not, women of color, particularly Black women, had the lowest pay and were doing the most work, especially when it came to childcare, which is based on enslaved Black women taking care of white babies. And here we are today, right? Women are now being paid to take care of other people's children, but they're still not receiving a wage that allows them to care for their own families. So while we have moved forward, right? And this is just one example. There are dozens of others. While we have moved forward, again, we're not at the end. And it is the responsibility of all levels of government, industry, business, to be ensure that we do change it. That it is that women and femme presenting folks and anyone else have, what did I say at the beginning? Access and opportunity to thrive, and no one is struggling to survive.
Right.
Women are still earning, 80 cents to a man's dollar?
Yeah.
And that's white women.
Yeah.
Then,
white women.
The number goes down
from there. Yeah.
So yeah, we've made progress.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's over.
Okay. So we've talked about history. We've talked about Jamaica and Herstory a little bit. What are the biggest challenges facing women and femme presenting folks today? And I know we could probably list off 100 things. And how will these change in the next 20 years? Or how do they need to change in the next 20 years, Jamaica?
I mean, we need to end the binary system that exists, that doesn't allow everyone to fully represent and reflect themselves. That was imposed on us based on, to be very blunt, whether you have a penis or a vagina, which does not encompass people's lived experiences and who they are as individuals. And we need to keep having conversations while at the same time demanding change. I'm not the first person to say it. I won't be the last, but change doesn't happen because it's supposed to. It only happens when it's demanded. Well-meaning folks all of the time say, oh, I wish I could. Man, be willing to be uncomfortable, be willing to take risks and to stand with the person that you think people don't like. Ask yourself, why do they not like that person? Is it because they're saying we need to change things? And why is change bad? How does it help or hurt? And who is it helping or hurting? Right? So in 20 years, because my children will then be my age, some of them young, will be in this world.
Right.
My younger daughter is 11. My oldest daughter is going to be 28 this year. This is the world they live in. And they are facing those challenges right now. And for us to eliminate those challenges, we need to be able to work together collectively across all of those subcategories that I have a ridiculous habit of listing. um, but to work collectively together and recognize that we can create change, and we should. Simply saying, I did that, it's over,
Mm-hmm.
is not the answer. Oh, we're in a post-racial society. No, we're not.
Mm-mm.
Oh, the women's movement happened and we won. We won some things. We have not reached equity and equality for women or any other marginalized groups, because it wasn't that long ago that immigrant women in this country were sterilized in cages on this land that we call the United States. So how can we say that the feminist movement is over, or that women's rights are all here, if those types of horrors are still continuing to happen?
Mm-hmm. Right. It's very interesting that we do hear that people saying, we've won, it's over, we can move forward with another social or racial justice issue, and really that's not the case. So I thank you for bringing light to that subject, that the work continues by all of us, and again, all of us, I know that's cliche, but it is true. It has to be everybody collectively demanding change. It can't be, we're going to make this change, or the change was made and everything's, there's always change to be made as we move forward in this work. So thank you for that. We're gonna go to our last question, because you were correct. There was no way we're gonna get through 11 questions, but this question hopefully is a little bit fun. If you could speak with any woman, femme-presenting person in history, who would it be, and what kind of questions or insights would you be talking about or asking, or just like if you could sit on a park bench and just somebody could sit next to you, anyone, who would it be and what would you talk about?
So it's hard. My first person is absolutely Ida B. Wells, because I really just would want to listen to how she bit the train conductor and what it felt like. But it's my great grandmother. It
Sure.
is, because while I got to meet her and know her as a child, I didn't get to speak to her as an adult. And while I have stories and I can, remember her saying to me, "That's not my president," I didn't get to hear the story from
Mm-hmm.
her, and talk about what it meant for her to leave the land that she called home,
Mm-hmm.
and to leave back the culture that she was raised in, and then to marry a Black man. Um,
Right.
like, I left the reservation and married a Black man, and here
Mm-hmm.
I am. And to just be with her in a space that allows that type of conversation from her lived experience.
Sure.
Someone that was born in the 1800s, right? Like my great grandmother was born
The
in
energy, the presence,
right, and so that would be amazing for me. But that's probably true of all of the matriarchs in my
sure.
family, is that I would love the opportunity to hear from them and talk to them. Luckily, my Aunt Evelyn, who is 96,
Mm-hmm.
is still with us. And so I do have an opportunity to speak to her from time to time and hear from her and my older cousins, because I'm very much the baby. I'm the
Okay.
baby at 48, I know. But that type of rich history from a personal level, means a lot to me. And I hope that other people, whether their ancestors are still here or not, that they get an opportunity to do that type of research, because it is something else that is stolen from us, right? In the US, women are told to take their husbands' names.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the norm. And if that's what you want to do, that's cool.
Right.
It's why I say, don't call me Miss or Mrs. anything. My name is Jamaica. And that I'm proud of my last name, but I also know that it came with blood and trauma,
Right.
from my father's family.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to speak to them in that context, as their kin.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for the honesty, the shedding light on your history, as well as the history of your own family and the history of women, coming from your eyes and your mind and your spirit. So her name is Jamaica. And don't call her anything else. I just have some words that through this interview I've pulled out: probability, possibility, demand change, voice, power, a continuation of change, women left out of history, reliving those stories, matriarch, common struggles, no filter, learning to listen, also speaking a lot, and true and amazing advocacy and activism on the part of Jamaica Miles. We want to thank you for being here with us, sharing you, not just it's not an easy thing to do, to open up and be vulnerable. We know that. So I just want to be really clear that I am honored that you offered to do this with me on March 1st, the beginning of Women's History Month. And thank you for your time. Is there anything you have not shared with us that you really feel you want to get out there at this time?
The only thing I want to say is be part of the change. Find a way. There's any number of ways you can be involved, be a part of the change, whether it's with all of us or any other group or organization, the YWCA. Find a space to be a part of the change, because it does take all of us.
It does. Thank you, Jamaica. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kim.